Since 1971, there has been a company that has as part of their slogan a good neighbor policy. Name that company. Well, you're well aware of the jingle. Just like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. I wasn't expecting harmony, but you know, it's part of what comes. This beat-up traveler on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho needed to have somebody that was there. When I think of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see many examples of faith. We see many stories, and each Gospel writer brought their own perspective, their own contribution to what we know of Jesus' earthly ministry. And you'll find that the parable of the Good Samaritan is found only in the Gospel of Luke. There's another very famous parable that's only found in the Gospel of Luke. Do you know what that one is? The parable of the prodigal son. Those are two of the most well-known parables. And Luke has given to us an example of faith that has been lifted up throughout the generations as a shining example of how we demonstrate our love by doing something. And the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was, well, it had a reputation as being very dangerous. It's kind of like some of those streets in a big inner city. What's the counsel around that? If you're going down there, don't go after dark. There's just some places you don't go because you know they're not a good place to be. And that was the road from Jerusalem to Jericho because of the terrain. The landscape was ideal for robbers and thieves to hang out there and jump the travelers as they were going along. And we don't know why this man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. We don't know if he was foolhardy to be traveling alone, and when he was traveling, we just simply know that he needed help. And there's something else that was prevalent in that route, and that is that because the robbers were prevalent, they often developed different strategies to deceive travelers. It wasn't unusual for one of them to act as a decoy, to disguise themselves as an injured person laying on the side of the road. And as soon as someone took a little risk and stepped over to see what they could do, they jumped up, and so did the rest of the gang, and attacked them, and maybe that's what happened to this guy. We don't know, but there was a reputation for that road, and so we keep those things in mind. Maybe crossing to the other side seemed wise, given all those factors. It's easy to see that there are risks involved in being a good neighbor. There's not only the risk of being attacked yourself, there was some other factor along that travel route that Jesus described that presented an extra caution to the priest and the Levite. If this man who was laying on the road was actually dead and they went and touched him, they would have been defiled for 7 days. They couldn't have gone to worship because the law says anyone who touches a dead body is banned from worship for 7 days. Now, who were these first two guys mentioned? A priest and a Levite. Being banned 7 days would be a pretty big deal for them. And Jesus knew that would be pretty important to the expert in the law that was questioning him. But there was something else that Jesus also recognized about this expert in the law that was questioning him about, well, who's my neighbor? And that was that he included a Samaritan in this parable. Now, Samaritans were hated by the Jewish people. They were hated because they were viewed as half-breeds. They forsook the pure Jewish ancestry after their exile to the country, the kingdom of Assyria. And they came back and intermarried with foreign peoples that was forbidden. And so they were treated with contempt. And the Jews, when they would travel in the direction of Samaria, would actually make it a point to go around Samaria so that they wouldn't have the problem that this road from Jerusalem to Jericho presented. It was not unusual for a Jewish person trying to travel through Samaria for them to get attacked and robbed. So they didn't want to have that kind of a scenario. Have you noticed when Jesus tells a parable, he's a master at drawing us into it? He's a master at calling us to just enter into that scene and become part of that. And as he's doing that, he brings conviction to us about what we should do in hearing that parable. And the expert of the law asked the question, who's my neighbor? And it's probably a good question for us today. Are people driving on the highway with us considered our neighbors? Well, some are saying, yeah, and others, well, depends, and others, no. Well, if they have a bumper sticker that is a hot button for us, should we consider them our neighbor? Well, what if they slow us down from getting to our appointment or, heaven forbid, cut us off in traffic? Should we give them the good neighbor hand signal? Notice I didn't emphasize any part of my hand when I said that. Sometimes we need help defining neighbor. And I ran across this in my study, and I thought it was a pretty fair assessment of how I would understand a neighbor. This definition says, anyone in need whose need we know of and can meet. That's a neighbor. Anyone in need whose need we know of and we can meet. Now, we might look at neighbors in our hood, neighborhood. We might say, well, our neighbors don't really have any needs. And Jesus might say to us, really? Are you sure about that? Are you just seeing what's outwardly understandable? Or are you going beyond the superficial to see their relational and spiritual needs? There's some things that we need to look at when we think about being neighbors, good neighbors, that call us to go a little beyond just what we happen to observe. What holds us back from being good neighbors? Well, different values, traditions, morals, politics. Is a good neighbor one who just minds their own business? Well, for some of you, you might say, well, that'd be a step up. Is a good neighbor a peace-loving person that just doesn't want to get involved? And do we prefer to define neighbor on our own terms? To make sure we're not risking rejection? Because, boy, Jesus always seems to be pushing our comfort zones, doesn't he? He's always harping on, love your neighbor as yourself. For some of us, depending on what we're presently facing in our own lives, we look at that, love your neighbor as yourself, and what being a good neighbor calls for, and we just may say, man, I am on overload now. I've got all I can handle. How can I reach out and in the way that Jesus seems to be saying here, be that kind of neighbor? I'm overloaded. I got all I can handle is what I've got. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been there? Well, there are several things worth remembering in this parable. The Samaritan saw a need that he could meet, and he did it during normal activities. What I mean by that is he didn't go by and leave ministry to somebody else. That's sort of what the priest and the Levite did, right? They said, oh, somebody else will do that, I'm sure. I mean, that guy really needs help. Somebody else will do that. Well, the video was titled, Do Something. And that's really what we're reminded of, that sometimes we look for those unique, exceptional, spiritual opportunities. You know, that really say, well, I can see that. I can't miss that. That's right in front of me, because that's obviously what the Lord wants me to do. But there are those many more times where we're just going through our normal routine, whatever that may be, and God's got a divine appointment right in the middle of our normal routine. There's nothing, quote, spiritual looking about it. I don't think that this Samaritan man said before he started on his journey from Jerusalem to Jericho, you know, I'm really going to be looking for some guy laying on the road. I really think he was just doing normal business, and he encountered a need, and that's when he was called to step into that do something mode. Now, no doubt, the priest and the Levite felt sorry for that man. I truly believe they had pity on him, but they said, no, I can't risk it. And Jesus points out and says, they didn't do something. They needed to do something in that situation. The priest and the Levite were on the very same road as this man laying over on the side, but they didn't do anything. That's what the Samaritan was distinguished in Jesus' story. That's what distinguished him. He did something. Now, I have to confess that it's not so easy to see how we can help somebody. Some time ago, I went to a Tigers game. Go Cubs. And after the game, it was a night game, and after the game, when that crowd was leaving Comerica Park, there were quite a number of people who were there with receptacles, looking for a handout. And there were people who were giving them whatever they did. I didn't stand and watch, but I just noticed there were some who were dropping money into the cup or the the container. And for some of those who were looking for help, there was a distinct odor of alcohol. And as I made that observation, I was reminded again, it's not always easy to identify how to really help somebody. They were looking for help, but there's that challenge as to what is going to really be helpful, not just for the short term, but for the long haul. And for many of you may not know this, we have a couple of funds available through the ministry of this congregation. One is called the Angel Fund, and the other is the Pastor's Discretionary Fund. And these funds are used to help people with paying utilities and, things like that. And they come to the church office asking for that kind of help, and we have to determine whether or not we can help them. And that's not always an easy assignment. That's not as easy as it might seem for two reasons. Number one, the last time I checked those funds, they're not in the millions of dollars. So there's some discernment that has to take place on who we can help. And if I help this person, let's say on December 15th, will I be able to help anybody else before the end of the year or before the money runs out? And the other thing that Flossie and I sort of kick around is, how can we help them beyond just giving them the money part of things? Do they need some counsel on managing their finances? Do they need to have somebody help them set up a budget? Those practical things that are going to go beyond what their immediate need is to what their long-term shift in the direction of their lives might indicate. So being a neighbor is not just so cut and dried. There's a lot of complexity to it. And I'm not simply using those illustrations to say, well, there's some loopholes, so I don't have to do anything. Sometimes those are the struggle points. It just so happened that we had helped an individual. They'd come to the church, and we'd helped them a couple of times. And then I saw them standing near a street corner in Flint with a sign. So I stopped. And I said, "What are you doing? What are you doing here? Why are you out here? Well, I'm collecting for a friend." So I said, "What do you need? Because you need to come to the church, and we'll talk about that. I think we can help you. But don't be out here asking for stuff if we can help you." And so he did come in, and we talked, and it turns out that we couldn't help him because he was asking for things that you wouldn't want me to be distributing the funds of the church for. But I had to take the extra time to talk to him and find out, what's this all about? And you've seen them standing right there when you come off the expressway with the sign. And the signs are variable. It depends on who the person is holding up the sign. But the point is that I had already established a relationship with that person. But doggone it, I don't want to be conned. I don't want to be deceived by somebody who presents themselves as a needy person, and yet when you dig a little deeper, you find out that's not a real need. That's something you shouldn't be going after anyway. And so, it's not so easy to figure out how best to help. I know that our faith is in action today. You know how I know? Because when you put money into those noisy buckets, you were demonstrating faith that someone who receives those funds will get them to the people who need them. Aren't we demonstrating faith that way? In the same way, as we launch our stewardship campaign, when you give your offerings, you're trusting, your faith is in action, that you are believing we're, as a congregation, as a leadership team, going to handle those funds appropriately and get them where they are needed. True? Amen. So, I think of the Flint water crisis, and I think of the Haiti situation, and I realize that we can't always be there to personally check up and see that persons are getting the help they need. Anybody scheduled their flight to Haiti? Probably none of us will go to see that those funds go to the people that really need them. So we have to exercise faith and believe that they're going to be given to those who need them. The Samaritan came prepared to be a good neighbor, didn't he? He came prepared to be a good neighbor. It says that he bandaged the man. He poured on oil and wine. Oil to bring healing. Wine, what's the big antiseptic in wine? Alcohol. Okay, so he took care of the immediate need, and he took care of the long-term need, because he left the innkeeper with extra money to cover expenses, and he said, if there's anything above that, just let me know, I'll settle the account. So he came prepared for being a good neighbor beyond just that initial contact. Isn't that what we're trying to do in Family Promise? Isn't that what we're trying to do in Family Promise? That we're trying to meet an immediate need, but we're also trying to be a good neighbor for the long haul. And there's success stories around Family Promise ministry. And I'm sure Susan and Ellen can supply those if you want to know the particulars. So the Samaritan was prepared physically, emotionally, financially. He thought through what he might do in those situations, and he provided short-term and long-term care. Doing the good neighbor thing. Being a good neighbor is not always welcome, though. We're finding that out in this nation, aren't we? Being a good neighbor is not always welcomed. If the needy don't like you, they may not receive what you want to give them. Yet faith does not withhold God-honoring service, because when we serve others, whom are we ultimately serving? The Lord. And who knows how many people throughout the ages this parable has touched. Hearing about how a man who was hated by the Jews helped a needy Jewish man. Is that relevant for the United States of America? Is that an example of being a good neighbor in a place where we are becoming more and more divided? Is that something we can hold up as an example of faith and say, we're going to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do and because it honors the Lord? So maybe if we see that kind of radical example, that one faith example might be able to turn things around. And maybe the real question shouldn't be, who is my neighbor? Maybe for us as Jesus followers, the question might be put a different way. Who is not our neighbor? Who is not our neighbor? And where do we find ourselves in this parable? Where do we put ourselves in this parable? Because this is the place where Jesus speaks to us as well as to that expert in the law. He's challenging us. Where do you fit into this picture? And what is Jesus calling us to do as his disciples right now? Maybe he would say to us, as he did that religious leader, go and do likewise. What that guy did, what that Samaritan man did, go and do likewise. And by doing that, we can put our lives in the potter's hand. We can allow ourselves to be shaped and molded and used by the one who calls all of us to serve him.